So as we are getting everything set, you can just. I just want to say thank you to our other faculty and teams folks for being here. This is a project that I've been doing in different iterations with students for the past 5 or 6 years. I think it's really important as we really consider our role as speech language pathologists. Not only we've spent the semester studying neurogenics in overlooked populations, but frequently that's not enough for us to be figuring out what our role is, how we can be helpful, what do we need to understand. So the other thing that I want to say is that sometimes these can be pretty intense. You know that just from the work that you've been doing. So after each presentation, we're going to have a little bit of time for some discussion. Please know if at any point you feel a little bit overwhelmed, you feel uncomfortable. You know, there's a little bit of uncomfort that's supposed to come with this. If you're feeling like this is more than you should be feeling right now, you are welcome to get up and go to the bathroom. Just is okay. So thank you for going through this. And I think, should we give it a shot, Dr. Ross-Katz?
Yeah, she may come in after. Thanks. Go ahead and get going.
Fabulous. Okay, just wanted to reiterate what Dr. Carden already said. Thank you everyone for being here. It means a lot. We put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears in this presentation. So myself, Madison, Cecilia, and Morgan, we were tasked with researching adults with TBI in the criminal justice system. So that's what we're going to be moving into. And right after that, we're going to show you our video.
Many individuals were under the influence of drugs and alcohol. This causes difficulties problem solving, understanding and following directions, expressing themselves accurately, or managing their impulsivity. The criminal justice system sets up a complicated and confusing environment. A person might find it challenging to follow directions from an officer and answering questions in a socially and culturally appropriate manner. Not to mention, legalese or legal jargon makes it extremely difficult for someone to understand their charges, affidavit, or plea deal. Understanding this information is critical because it will affect their lives.
I'm going to explain the intersection that exists between traumatic brain injury and the criminal justice system. To begin, the rates of TBI are exponentially and disproportionately higher in the criminal justice system compared to in the general public. The rates for TBI in the criminal justice system are 25 to 85% of inmates, whereas in the general public, it is only 8.5%. As well, in Colorado, there was a study that came out of the University of Denver that stated that up to 96% of Colorado inmates have a history of traumatic brain injury. These are very concerning statistics, considering that often the consequences of TBI are more severe when involved in the criminal justice system. That exists at the police encounter level, in the courtroom level with someone trying to explain or defend themselves efficiently and effectively, as well as for the person with a TBI trying to comprehend and understand their plea deal, their affidavit, or the charges that are being brought against them. As well, an important aspect of this intersection is that TBI does not equal criminality. For someone that has a TBI, that does not mean that they are going to become a criminal. This intersection can also be thought of more effectively as this cycle, as this really damaging cycle that I will explain with this slide. Beginning here, adverse experiences increase one's risk of sustaining a TBI. These can include a history of alcohol and drug abuse, trauma and abuse as a child, poverty and homelessness, systemic racism. Any of those experiences can increase one's risk of traumatic brain injury. And that leads into the fact that if you have a TBI, it is likely that you'll have difficulties in cognitive communication, leading us down here, where these difficulties in cognitive communication often lead to worse outcomes in the criminal justice system. This is often seen through harsher sentences, which leads us to this piece of the cycle where being in the criminal justice system, being incarcerated itself is a risk factor for traumatic brain injury. And bringing us right back to the top of the cycle where being incarcerated is also an adverse experience. As you can see, it is a quite damaging cycle. It is really difficult for someone with a traumatic brain injury in the criminal justice system to effectively advocate for themselves and manage the complex communication and cognitive situations in the criminal justice system. As well, the criminal justice system does not offer a lot of resources that address the cognitive and communication difficulties that they experience. However, there are some really exciting things coming out of the field of criminology and the field of speech-language pathology, and tying together these two fields to help give services and resources for those with a TBI involved in the criminal justice system. And that is outlined further in our PowerPoint, where we also provide really helpful resources for anyone that's interested. Thank you.
You're good to talk. You want me to put your slides back up? Yeah. Right here. The next one. You want the video?
Not yet.
Okay.
And now we are going to listen to the story of Markel Taylor Bay. And he is someone who has firsthand experienced a TBI along with being involved in the criminal justice system and is actually doing really great things for the community.
Give me just a sec, because I have to share the screen so the audio can share. Our friends at home.
Impulsive.
While serving a 21-year sentence for robbery, he wanted to put those mistakes in his past. He educated himself about business, found a business partner, and when he got out, they got to work, but he soon found himself back inside.
36 days later, after doing 21 years of incarceration, I went and robbed a Papa John's pizza. My brain just shut down. And people was wondering how, after doing all of this time, having the business education he had.
While he takes ownership of his actions, Markel learned about ongoing research from the University of Denver that suggests he was also a prisoner of his own mind.
Didn't know I had a traumatic brain injury. I didn't even know I had mental health issues.
The CDC defines a traumatic brain injury, or TBI, as an injury that can affect how the brain works. Caused by a blow to the head, it's a major cause of disability. New findings by researchers estimate that 50 to 80% of America's prison population has had a TBI. Outside of prison, less than 9% of the general population has had a traumatic brain injury. The statistics are worse for incarcerated women. 97% have had a traumatic brain injury, and half have had multiple. The results of this groundbreaking research was shocking to the study's author, Dr. Kim Gorgans, who has been speaking out since, including in this TED Talk, which she provided to us.
In this way, these women's brains look like the brains of retired NFL players. And they'll likely face the same risks for dementing diseases as they age.
Dr. Kim Gorgan's research has shown that TBIs can impact someone's ability for self-regulation, judgment, reasoning, and problem solving. And that, she says, can lead inmates to reoffend once they get out of jail.
You know, trauma is the only thing that we let get to a stage 4, you know, before we start to treat it. And the treatment is prison.
Corey Shively met Markel in prison and is now his business partner at their marketing company. Thanks to the study, they both discovered TBIs they suffered while they were younger have impacted their judgment and impulse control and are now getting help for it. They've now made it their mission to educate their communities about traumatic brain injuries.
We should have better resources in our community to be able to deal with this trauma up front. We shouldn't have to wait till Markel's 47 and I'm 40 years old for us to get some therapy.
They've taken their mission to the Colorado state capitol with hopes of changing policy across the nation. They helped create a new law that mandates neuropsychological exams for inmates once they get sentenced. If a mental illness or brain injury is detected, psychologists make 2 plans, one for prison staff to manage the inmate and the other for the inmate on how they can better themselves, all with the hope of reducing recidivism.
They're going to be able to see what's going on with their brain, become more aware, and, you know, like we like to say, trauma-informed, trauma-conscious, trauma-responsive.
Markel hopes that this is just the first step in helping people like himself recognize their own disability to make themselves and everyone around them safer.
We're here to help this state be returned back to a baseline state of safety so people can operate effectively and they don't have to suffer in silence.
For The Race, I'm Vanessa Bashania.
All right, so in that video, they spoke about what a TBI is and the severity, as well as how a concussion is equivalent to a mild traumatic brain injury, which is very common, and the most common causes are falls, car accidents, sports, assault, out of other factors that cause it. And here we can see the effects of TBI, which Morgan spoke about earlier. There are physical, behavioral, and cognitive effects. However, as SLPs, our main area of focus is cognitive, specifically the A, executive functionings. For example, self-control, where a person is able to stop and think before acting, self-monitor to be able to understand their own bodies and their own needs, emotional control to understand their feelings as well, and to complete tasks while understanding those emotions. The flexibility that is essential to completing tasks in everyday life. Task initiation to start the actual process of these activities. Organization, which is important in anybody's life. Working memory to be able to recall that information that is also required to complete tasks, and then planning and time management, which are all very essential to be successful in life.
Okay, so kind of what we did, similar to our little mini video, we just wanted to give a brief baseline for traumatic brain injury for criminal justice, just to make sure that everyone has a good understanding before we dive into how they're intersecting. So to briefly just go over again the criminal justice system. So it's a system of law enforcement consisting of the police, the courts, and correctional facilities. To just make it clear, there is a difference between jail and prison, and the fact that jail is transient. That's where people usually wait to be charged. And then prison is more long-term. And then to speak about the incarceration rates in Colorado, as you can see with this chart, this is United States and Colorado compared to many other countries. And as you can see, even at the state level, there are more people incarcerated in Colorado than any of these countries. And then just to go over the cognitive communication profiles of justice-involved individuals, the education level is usually very low for these individuals. The literacy rates are alarmingly low, and that 70% of inmates can't read above the 4th grade level. As you can imagine, trying to understand legalese or even just, really highly contextual conversation would be very difficult for someone in the criminal justice system. Like I said, it's incredibly complicated and unusual environment. There's a lot of new words and a lot of pragmatics and social situations that you have to navigate, which can be quite challenging to do correctly. And then also a lot of individuals who are incarcerated or arrested are under the influence of drugs and alcohol, which really decrease your ability to communicate, to understand, to be to effectively defend yourself in these kind of situations. Okay, and so here we are at the intersection, which we want to make clear that now that we've established kind of what TBI is, what the criminal justice system is, these things cannot be separated and should not be separated anymore in our understanding, especially in our treatment for these individuals. So TBI rates in the criminal justice system are significantly higher than in the general public, which leads to TBI increases the likelihood of worse outcomes, like I said, usually often worse sentencing for these individuals. And then incarceration increases one's risk of TBI. So it's this cycle, right? If you have a TBI, it's difficult for you to get yourself out of the criminal justice system. And if you're in the criminal justice system, you're more likely to have a TBI. So it's kind of a really dangerous cycle for a lot of individuals.
Okay, and then we also have the prevalence of TBI in the criminal justice system. We kind of went over this a little bit earlier as well, but 25 to 87% of inmates report having experienced a head injury. That's not even including like a lot of people did not self-identify, so it could be a lot higher. So you have to keep that in mind. There's a lot of lack of understanding of what that is. People don't think of concussions being a traumatic brain injury, but repeated successions of those, it's gonna eventually snowball and catch up to you, especially being in the justice system. Up to 96% have a history of at least one in Colorado. And then we also have our pilot study from the University of Denver that's in the charts.
And just to break down these charts a little bit. So history of TBI in the general public is pink. History of TBI, as you can see, is much larger in the criminal justice system.
And then we also have just a profile for the COGCOM of those with TBI in the criminal justice system. So we have to think about communication. How is that being impacted? you have to think about their attention deficits and how that's impacting their pragmatics. Memory as well, can they, I mean, if they're talking or listening to a lawyer or a judge, can they retain that information and then really understand what's going on and be able to work with that to advocate for themselves? Irritability and anger is also a big one. If your mood's off, it's going to be potentially making it more difficult to control and lead to more dangerous and severe situations. Also, there's just slow verbal and physical responses. It takes more time. Judges can get more like irritated with that individual, even though that's not necessarily something that they're doing on purpose. Also, poor judgment is another big one associated with this population as well. And then we have the effects of TBI in the criminal justice system, mental health problems as well, like anxiety and depression. Self-reported help, again, not everybody knows what traumatic brain injury is to sort of self-identify that. It's on the lower end. And then as far as among male prisoners, a history of TBI is strongly associated with perpetration of domestic abuse.
Here we can see how all of this intersects. Not only are we talking about people in the criminal justice system, we're talking about those with precarious housing, refugees, asylum-seeking indigenous people, and also those who experience those above. And along with all this intersectionality, we also see two big things: the risk factors due to TBI. For example, being incarcerated, being in a shelter, substance abuse, mental health. We also talk about housing, socioeconomic status, and negative peer associations. And then we also have to think about the barriers to accessing care to be able to receive the help that they do need. And those barriers include experiences of colonization or trauma that keeps them from receiving the help that they need, experience with racism, or a lack of cultural knowledge, responsibility from healthcare providers, experience being someone from a lower socioeconomic status, and then along with trauma, there's PTSD, racism, and even to the extent of torture. So we can see how we can't really separate all of these factors. They really do intertwine with each other.
First,
And then other risk factors or considerations to keep in mind when you're looking at this population are whether they're people of color. There's poverty and homelessness, again, the abuse and sexual violence, drug and alcohol abuse, mental health issues, and other things we brought up, like the literacy rates, how well they can read, difficulties in school, so the experiences they've had before being incarcerated or even during. And another population that is also really important to consider is being a transgender or a gender non-binary is very important to keep in mind as well. And also just the history, not just will they, because there is a higher chance of getting a TBI in the prisons, if they've already, especially if they already had a history of previous TBI. And just keep in mind, there's a lot more to add to this list. This is just very surface level.
These are shared risk factors also for TBI and incarceration.
And then some other considerations, considering those with TBI and in the justice system, specifically with women or female inmates convicted of a violent crime, they have sustained a TBI prior in the form of physical abuse. And also with these women who have had substance use disorders, there's an increased risk of TBI if they do have substance use disorders, and compared with other women in the general U.S. population. And again, with women, there are repeated head injuries as well. So they, like in the video with Kim Morgan, she was talking about how they look like, their brains look like retired NFL players. And some other populations to consider as well with both TBI and CGAS is the homelessness rate, and is related to both injury, head injury, and also prior imprisonment. And we also have to think about the youth as well, or how they spent their child or teenager years, because they are more likely to have a pre-crime TBI and some other kind of physical abuse when they're earlier stages of life. And also, when we compare people in the system with a TBI and non-injured peers, we can see that there's difficulty comprehending legal language. Like we said, legalese is very complicated to navigate, especially if you are having those difficulties already.
Okay, just right on time. So this is Dr. Andrea Borrego, and she is the department chair of the Criminal Justice and Criminology program here at MSU Denver, and we had the honor of interviewing her and getting her expertise. So this first section is just some facts and interesting thoughts that she pointed out to us, indicating some intersectionality through high indigenous population rates in Denver specifically. Also, she provided some resources and noted on the fact that in minority of the translator, it lengthens the process, which could be a deterrent for asking for something like that. And it also brings up fears of immigration law and ICE. I think this was taken out of our interview, and we asked her specifically her opinion, after giving her all these facts, on incarcerating individuals with a history of TBI, and we all agree that that is a big question and hard to break down. It's hard to know how do we start this process, where do we intervene, and then TBI intervention. She suggested possibly that TBI considerations could be implemented because there are different types of specialty courts, and potentially that could be a way to address it, as well as taking TBI into consideration when thinking about culpability and understanding one's culpability. It's likely that that would be difficult for someone to do, especially difficult with someone with a TBI. And finally, which is a good thought from our expert, is that it's very complicated and would require a lot of steps to support people with TBI. However, it is important and it is something that we're working on and we're making steps towards. And here are just a graphic of all the resources and all of the adjacent facilities that are connected with traumatic brain injury and or the criminal justice system. And my gal pals are going to pass those around to everyone, which takes us also to this resource page. And so when we thought about this project in general, our mini video was really just a brief crash course into what this topic in general. But we really wanted that to be paired. I think it's crucial that this is paired with our PowerPoint because this really goes into the specifics of TBI and the criminal justice system. It also has links and further resources that we couldn't fit on our little handout. And there's some Colorado specific ones and then also some general information which could be used for individuals interested and also criminal justice staff and related faculty.
And then this is the video of that woman and expert, Morgan's, which is her TED Talk on the matter. It's really informative, so if you have questions, please resources for you as well.
And I'd actually like to mention that she has directly helped Markel.
Yes. So looking ahead, this is kind of during the incarceration phase. When we're thinking about these individuals, we should be doing increased health screenings and evaluations to really get down to the root if there actually is something going on. There's possible alcohol and substance abuse involved in that, so we need to be aware of that as well when doing this. Additional evaluations that can be specific to traumatic brain injury related problems. Looking at their impulsive behavior, is that present, is that not? And treating those underlying problems, getting in there, providing the support that they need. We also need to be aware of reporting it back to the system, and and making suggestions on how to manage those inmates, and also providing suggestions on how the inmate can manage themselves and what they can do while they're in that situation. And then also this behavior is more of a deficit and not a defiance, so just keeping that aware in terms of the perspective of the law.
Here we're looking at what needs to be done post-incarceration. For example, we're talking about the community and the reentry staff, and it would be very helpful if these individuals were to be trained to be able to identify a history of a TBI, so looking for those signs that could be really good indicators. Also have access to appropriate consultation with other professionals in the expertise in TBI, so speaking to maybe psychologists or SLPs or other individuals who are also knowledgeable in this area, and to keep educating these individuals as well. And then when we're looking at transition services, transitioning from the prisons or jails back to the community, we need to be able to address and accommodate for them. So giving them the support, and it's not giving them a handout, but it's giving them the tools to be successful in life. And there's also needing to be resources for those who also have mental health issues or substance abuse problems, because they're going to need more support on top of that if they also have a TBI. And then big one would be developing self-advocacy skills, and I believe this would be overcoming the stigma that there is when there is difficulties asking for help. So knowing what their needs are, what they need to do to get them and get their needs met. And along with that is changing the negative perception, so getting rid of that stigma, especially when there's a stigma towards people who have been incarcerated. And that would be in the form of case management services or placement into community treatment programs. And a good resource would also be connecting to university speech language pathology programs. In the state of Colorado, we have CU Boulder, Greeley, and now our newer one would be here at MSU.
And finally, just to tie it all together to our program, to our field, and how speech pathology can help. An important aspect that I think all fields are trying to do is have more interprofessional collaboration. We were lucky enough to talk with Dr. Borrego and get her understanding of criminal justice as an expert in that field and get some of her tips and ideas, and also spread awareness, because I think as she spoke in our interview, she let us know, like, well, I just don't know too much about TBI, and I think a lot of people don't know too much about TBI. However, it is growing. There's more social awareness to it. So some of the things that SLPs can help with is things like inference making, understanding of non-literal and ambiguous language, especially in the court system. Legalese is almost all non-literal and ambiguous language, and we can help target some aspects of executive functioning like memory, attention, and processing speed. And I just want to highlight also that there are some pioneers in the field. There are many more, but these are some people to take a look at if you have a chance. Dr. Shamika Stanford is the first and only juvenile forensic SLP. She's also a professor and a researcher out of the United States. And there's Dr. Lynn Churchstra. She's an SLP professor and researcher in this field. And Dr. Joseph Wozeliak is also a researcher and founder of the Center for Neurolaw and Equity. So there are good things happening, and there is professional collaboration happening. Just looking for more all the time.
Thank you for everyone's time. I know we went over a little bit, but we know that this is an important topic. So.
Any questions?
I have a question. Sorry. I heard you talking about training professionals who interact with folks after incarceration. I was wondering, did you come across anything about like training public defenders with that TBIs?
I personally did not come across that specifically. I mean, I would hope that would be in the works or something. Words.
Yeah.
Not specifically. Yeah, there is work trying to do that, and that would be a great place to start as far as awareness and also methods to help people better represent themselves. But I think it's down the pike.
And Leah,
Yeah, hi.
so part of the Colorado law, and actually one of the criticisms of the Colorado law, is that so the focuses of the law are on assessment and training of individuals within the criminal justice system, so who are interacting with folks. So theoretically, public defenders are on the list. You don't necessarily know how successful that training was in terms of dissemination and implementation, which I think is an important consideration. One of the other criticisms, a speech pathology criticism, is that it focuses on assessment and not on rehabilitation, which leads to my question. So, do you think there's a role for SLPs working in incarceration, thinking about either cognitive communication or literacy and/or literacy? And then maybe secondarily, as graduate students, how would you feel about having that kind of placement or role?
It's huge. I think we were talking, I think it was with you, Dr. Harden, about someone in the field, and she works in the women's prison, and yeah, we were talking about that amongst ourselves after that, and we just thought it'd be so powerful to be able to be in a placement like that, with the right guidelines and the right support as well. I think it would be super beneficial to be in that environment and to provide that support.
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible. The scholar we had here, Kim Borgens, she is a DU faculty, and she actually has done a lot of work in the jails with her students.
Yeah, and Dr. Shamika Sanford is really cool. I think she's out on the East Coast, but she is part of an SLP graduate program, and she has a program for graduate students to go and work in incarcerate correctional facilities, I don't know what I'm trying to say, and directly work with those impacted and those who are incarcerated. So it is happening, which is really cool. And I personally would love to do it. Alana, I don't know where Alana is. Full placement, and I would love to go. It is a possibility, and I think there's room, there's space, because there are other sort of interventions and therapies that are happening in the criminal justice system, and I think we could just tack ourselves right in.
How do you think that? Do you think that would be more successful potentially than meeting folks? There's sort of the recommendation, after you're released in that big period of transition, hey, let's add cognitive rehab. Kind of what are your thoughts about catching folks on the front end or, trying to catch them in transition?
I think it's better, and I think it'd be better to prevent or help prevent people from being incarcerated in general, because despite our best efforts maybe in incarcerated spaces, there are all of the other intersectionalities and all of the other systems that are in place make recidivism really high, regardless of cognitive communication. So if you're poor or homeless, you have even higher chances of being reincarcerated. So what I think would be cool is for all SLPs, including SLPs in the school system. As you might know, the school to prison pipeline is a big problem. And if SLPs that work in the school system have an opportunity to help some of those children that are being labeled as defiant or disruptive or something like that, if we can help sort of identify those things before it leads to a level of incarceration and punishment, I think that would probably be more beneficial. And then not say it's not beneficial, but of course having some sort of resources during and after will probably help reduce the rate of reincarceration.
We have a question from one of our virtual participants to move time. Did you find any research where implementing ACEs, adverse childhood assessments in schools can help with earlier detection?
Not assessments. I think it's kind of just like based on observation and what you see and going from there, but we can see the assessments.
No, I think knowing that those will increase your risk of a TBI, and also, knowing the TBI will, result in some of its own difficulties, I think that sort of knowledge is helpful and it should be implemented in the schools. However, yeah, I don't think we found anything specific to ACE assessments leading to SLP or TBI related things.
And I think there's a little bit more focus related to ACEs in juvenile incarceration because the timeline is so compressed. We're thinking about what happened to you in the past 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. And then hopefully we're going to see that move more into the adult population, but there is more literature at the juvenile level.
And this was specifically on adults. This topic is huge in general, so we kind of worked on the adult end.
Did you all read about or have any ideas about accommodations for kind of environmental factors for this population?
Are you thinking like drugging incarceration?
Yes.
I did read that it could be, instead of giving verbal directions, having reminders or a written way for them to see it or a visual that would help support them in understanding the language or what is being communicated to them. That would be one accommodation. Or even just like giving them time. Like one of the things was they have a slow response. It might take them time to react or to do something, so giving them time to be able to complete the action, which and on their end would require a lot of patience and knowledge of what is going on.
And I think also linking in SLP in those like preliminary stages, like when they're meeting with lawyers, when they're discussing all of these legal terminology, I mean SLPs have the unique skills to be able to ensure understanding and provide as many benefits for people in those front stages. I think that it would be awesome if SLPs could be part of that, this group of people that are involved in the beginning stages and throughout.
I just wanted to say I appreciate your inclusion of the interview with Markel, because I think what's been hardest about this project is to try and capture the voices of the people we're talking about, and I thought that was really helpful and powerful.
I'm gonna give you all a little bit of context because you don't get to see kind of the underbelly of how university systems work, whereas we do. And what was the College of Health and Applied Sciences is splitting. And it's gonna be the College of Health and Human Sciences and the College of Aerospace Engineering, ellipsis, ... And what's so cool, many things are cool about what's ahead, but I think one of the greatest positives is that the Department of Criminal Justice and Criminology is part of the College of Health, which is innovative in many ways. So a lot of times interprofessional education is dependent upon access to these professionals, right? So, I want to encourage you, even when it's hard to make connections because the system might silo you, there is immense power in finding those out and extending outside of your, echo chamber, if you will, of speech language pathologists. So thank you. This is such a fabulous example, I think, of the power of being in a broader college.
I mean, my wheels are already turning.
Mhm.
Like planning my email to the chief of mental health services at, the Denver jails, and talking more about this because again, it's not an area that I'm very well versed in, but I think, you all highlighted the importance of it, and it's with such like a population that's in and out of correctional settings quite often. Is what can we do better to at least react to what the situation is now and be proactive. You guys highlighted a lot of those good ideas.